I wanted to make a video about just the just to test the validity of this continuous narrative that we're being fed by the media. Basically, we get this concept being reinforced to us continuously that America is racist. The media seems to publicize all incidents that involve black victims. There's a continuously increasing rhetoric about just how white supremacist groups are on the rise. Hate groups, always some sort of white supremacy, white Nazi, extreme far right wing, etc. It paints a picture of just this constant danger for non-white minorities at the hands of the hateful white racists. It disputes any points around any given race being of any sort of higher criminality than another. And it just continuously reinforces the systemic racism narrative. And what I've noticed is that there's hardly any even intra-race crime rates. So typically you'll get just the complete non sequitur argument that, oh, well, if you look at black on black crime versus white on white crime, and there's never any discussion about specifically white on black crime, black on white crime, a comparison, right? Which you would think that would be just the most readily obvious evidence for racism that there ever was. Instead, they talk about, well, there's higher crime rates in the inner city, blah, blah, blah. So I did a little digging and wanted to find out some what stats, if any, are available, and was able to find some. And it specifically dealt with violent crime, and it broke it down by race of offender and race of victim. So here's my thesis. If the racism narrative is true, right, it should be reflected. If white hateful racists are attacking minorities, well, those are assaults, right? We're not talking about drug possession. We're not talking about unfairly targeting or racial prejudice and sort of, assigning some sort of sentencing. We're talking about actual racists attacking other races, which is what the perpetual fear being instilled in the narrative is, right? So that should be reflected in violent crime stats. White on black crime should be higher proportionately, even when you take into account, once you take into account population, there should be a higher proportionality of white on black crime if this is the rising tide of supremacist racism. White on Hispanic crime should also be higher than, say, Hispanic on white crime. Further sort of icing on the cake, in this report, I found that there's several breakdowns in terms of detailing the type of assault, the relationship between the attacker and the victim, etc. So I'm going to look at two specific subgroupings, which has to do with the type of weapon used, which I'm going to use as a proxy for intended harm. So obviously, if you punch someone, you're only liable to produce X amount of harm. However, if you use a blunt weapon, an edged weapon, or God forbid a firearm, then your intentions are significantly for more harm. So my contention would be that if we're talking racism, a racially animated hatred crime, right? That hatred translates into the desire to create to inflict much more harm. And also the other breakdown around the relationships between the attacker and the victim, the breakdown between domestic, close relationship, and stranger. Obviously, a racist should not wouldn't show a predilection to be in a domestic partnership, for example. Wouldn't be intimate with a member of the race he hates, nor would he be, counting them among their close associated, close relative or close friends that are likely to be bucketed in the bucket of stranger attacks, where the person was not a close relative nor a domestic partner. So, without further ado, the report I found, and I'm showing the listing, so feel free to either copy the listing or just search for it on Google. It's basically put together by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, which is part of the DOJ. And to be exact, violent crime constitutes a mixture of different types of crime. So simple assault. So whereas simple assault would be considered, something where you only use your fists. And then something that they term serious violent crime is also part of that bucket. And that's broken down into rape, sexual assault, and many types of aggravated assault. So assault with a deadly weapon, vehicular assault, etc. Now, the survey is the most recent one that I've been able to find of this type, and it covers the period of 2012 to 2015. And even though Hispanic is referenced as an ethnic group, just for brevity, I'm just gonna, call it a race. So please forgive me for the grammar purists out there. Now, right away, the numbers just fly in the face of the narrative. So, relatively speaking, there's 540,000 crimes that are committed by blacks against whites versus 92,000 crimes in the reverse, whites against blacks. In the Hispanic versus white comparison, the numbers are a little bit narrower, but still 406,000 Hispanic on white crimes versus 169,000 white on Hispanic. So just the incidence of nearly 6 times more incidents of crime, and this is not taking population into account. And then, of course, 2.4 on the Hispanic side. Now, just a pause for population. This is as of the last census. The population as of the last census was 63.7% white, 12.2% black, and 16.3% Hispanic, which basically makes it a 1 to 5.2 ratio in terms of black versus white population, and a 1 to nearly 4 Hispanic to white population. So once you actually tally those in, it makes the discrepancy in crime even larger. So just to kind of summarize, there's an absolutely significant discrepancy in the numbers of interracial violent crime. Not only does it oppose the current narrative, it kind of suggests the reverse of the narrative, which is even more damning. So black on white crimes occur, as I said, almost 6 times more than the reverse. But if you look at incidence, so if you take in population criteria, then a white person is 30 times more likely to be victimized by a black person than the reverse. And when exchanging black for Hispanic, 9 times more likely. Now, admittedly, these are all violent crimes. So we can't say that, every single one of these is racially animated. But if you take a moment to kind of contemplate, well, there'll be sort of crimes that are racially animated would be present in that bucket, obviously. Crimes that are, if there's such a thing as a regular crime, would also be present in that bucket. And those would be a function of the criminality level of that specific race, that specific group. Now, again, this is where I'm going to accept the media's narrative. Basically, there's always, opposition to characterize any race as being more criminal than any other one, unless, of course, we're talking about the white race. So let's just take them at their word and say everybody's the same. Then, even if you remove a like share in the buckets, that still leaves the largest buckets of racial crime in the wrong buckets, if you would, in the buckets that oppose this narrative. And the other bucket might be just pure incidentality, which is two different racial groups happen to be in the same place at the same time, and stuff popped off and things happened. But I'm going to also take the view that incidentality would have the same effect across all race groups, because it's not like one is more prone to incidentality versus another. So again, right away, this is just not these numbers don't go the way of the narrative. Now let's look at those specific 2 buckets I talked about. So now this is the offender versus the victim, whether or not the offender and victim were in a domestic relationship. So they were basically intimate. They were either boyfriend, girlfriend, spouses, or what have you. Whether they were close relative or close friend, or they were a stranger. So now again, if racism was the definitive characteristic of the white population, I would expect the stranger percentage to be the highest. And yet, if you see, it isn't. It's actually the lowest of all of the groups. So, and when you look at domestic and close, basically it seems that overall, I would say that these 2 scores, the close and the domestic, would seem to indicate, would be sort of an indication for being more associative. They, as one race group being more tolerant of another, being more accepting, therefore entering in domestic relationships or close relationships with said race group. So it paints the exact opposite picture of than the racism narrative. So incidentally, 49% likely to be involved in attacking a stranger, which is where you would want to bucket all of those, purely racist crimes. Both, and when compared to either of the racial groups, significantly lower by 15 points and by 5 points respectively. That doesn't fit the racism narrative. Okay, second bucket, level of force. Again, racially animated crime, hatred. It's called a hate crime for a reason, right? You truly hate the other race. You want to hurt them. You don't want to punch them if you can cut them. You don't want to cut them if you can shoot them. So obviously, you're likely to be more motivated to create more harm. And yes, there's some degree of incidentality where, you might have wanted to shoot them, but you forgot your gun. But again, incidentality should be reflected across the board the same way. So now, yet again, this goes against the narrative. So if you look at the amount of no weapon attacks when black on white crimes, 64%. Now, granted, I'm not looking at the numbers because just the numbers of crimes are so much larger than obviously, so I'm looking at percentage of. So 72% of the attacks that whites perpetrate on blacks are basically conducted without a weapon. Only 10% are conducted with a firearm, and 20% with any sort of bladed or edged weapon. Right? That's kind of significant when you consider that in all racial cases, either black on white crime or Hispanic on white crime, there seems to be a higher predilection towards using higher amounts of force approaching deadly force than basically simple assault. So again, this flies against the face of this narrative. So just basically in summary, we've already talked about how the incidence of crime is 30 times more likely when talking black on white versus white on black, 9 times more likely Hispanic. But just to recap the other components, when a white person attacks either a black or Hispanic, they are less likely to do so with a weapon or a firearm, and they are more likely to be unarmed. In all categories, whites perpetrate less crimes, less absolute number of crimes, despite their overwhelming ratio in population. Whites seem to show a higher predilection for association, and again, recognizing that this is still a crime report, so albeit fraught with assault. So sort of the conclusion here, at least from this data, is that a white person is significantly more likely to be a victim of racial animus than be the perpetrator of a racially animated crime. And in general, all of these indicators seem to show whites as the group exhibiting the least racist tendencies. Now, this is not necessarily to accuse the other racial groups of racism, and I'll get to that right now. And that really has to do with an embedded false narrative. I think there's an active culture of resentment and repression and vindictiveness that's being seeded by none other than the mainstream media, and I think it's time for us to recognize this, and it's time for us to basically take measures against it. So, false narrative. Okay, does the media lie? And I think it's probably worth taking a second and sort of explaining the strange situation we find ourselves in today. So, the media has been accustomed to having this gatekeeper role to current events for ages, right? You basically turn to the media as the primary or sometimes only source for the public news. Therefore, it put them in the unique position of being able to modify public opinion by manipulating what quote unquote the narrative. Now, remember, it's only a recent entry into our vocabulary, this idea of narrative being part of the news. Narrative is a story, a told story. So it's usually you tell a story when you're trying to influence. Journalism used to be about accuracy and representation with neutrality, not biased representation in any sort. The biased opinion pieces were supposed to be clearly marked, and they were supposed to be op-ed pieces. Well, news has long forgotten that distinction, and it seems that nearly almost all presentations are always opinion driven. Now, the media companies, they have grown rich because they've been able to attract advertising from special interest groups, large corporations that have basically a vested interest into driving a certain type of public opinion. So the public opinion that they wanted, the media could bring them because they could influence this. And as a result, they've made millions and millions, right? Well, until recently, because now with the advent of the internet and really the takeoff of YouTube content creators and sort of citizen journalism, now the internet provides alternative sources for news. Granted, with all the pitfalls of fake news, etc., but fundamentally, you now using the internet can go and do your own research. You can use the mainstream media sort of as just as a method to sort of flag what happened and then find out the real detail by digging into it. Oftentimes, they get beaten to the punch. They get scooped by citizen journalists, so internet can react much faster for a lot cheaper. They don't need as much investment. So now the media is watching their audience sort of decline, and their profits are melting. Now, imagine being in that position where you have made a ton of money by basically creating a commitment to the powers that be that you can deliver opinion change. And now you're watching your hold over the American viewership dropping. And the thing is, you only know one thing that generates viewership, and that's sensational topics, right? The more sensational, the more salacious, the more whatever, you know that they'll tune in. This is why they absolutely loved Trump forever. Now, and now it's even more fashionable to just say they hate Trump because that's what they believe within their little echo chambers. The problem is that increasingly they're not noticing the disconnect from the American people. But what do they have? They have sensationalism. So if they can't find it, they'll fabricate it, right? There is no longer not even an attempt to hold with journalism integrity, because frankly, there's no time when the news cycle when the news event to reporting cycle has shortened down to minutes because everyone's got a cell phone and everyone can post a video. They have zero intention to go check. And you're seeing this. I mean, the increasing prevalence of the anonymous source news, right? Or or just quoting somebody else, or the perpetual caveat that you hear nowadays. Almost all items are being presented with "if true." Well, if true was supposed to be their job. They were supposed to find out if something is true, right? So now they're just presenting flat out basically telling you that we don't know, but they're presenting it with the same sort of aplomb and the same authority as if this was, certified USDA choice fact. Well, it's bullshit, because they have been lying. They've been lying in subtle fashion, and it was harder for them to be caught. Now that they've had to become more sensationalist, they've been lying in greater and greater incidents, and it's easier for them to get caught. And they are panicking, and their only response is to lie bigger, because they have no other response. And of course, racism seems to be a narrative that just pays off, and I'll explain how that is. So why racism? Well, very simply, like I said, because it makes money. But just think about whenever the news media chooses to cover a crime, they have a choice, right? They can look at the vast plethora of crimes that they choose to focus on, and yet they repeatedly choose crimes with black victims because they want to paint this picture of a black oppression sort of narrative, a black, the black population being victimized at the hands of the white population. Now, I hope you remember from the previous slides that the incident of crime, and that's not adjusting for population, just the general availability of crimes, it's 6-1. So for every one of these stories that they choose to show you, they ignore 6 other stories of the exact opposite of black on white crime. Now, that's not incidental. That's not just, well, we just didn't cover that because it was coincidence. This has to be active effort every single time. But why would they do this? Well, because they're the ones making the choice. They can actually persist this narrative. They can create a fake narrative that, here, because we're only going to show you this side of the house, we're going to basically use that selection as a method to create and reinforce this story that there is persistent racism. And up till now, you really had no way of refuting it. And even now, I mean, if you go out of your way to report this and to research this, you're, to the degree that you ever get into the public limelight, you get pegged with, conspiracy theorist or, racist, fascist, whatever. The point is, these are not numbers that I'm making up. These are numbers straight out of the government. Now, as this narrative is built and believed, it has an effect on society. It increases division, it increases unrest, and it builds this vindictive sentiment. So I think that what is deep at the root of the increased incidence of crimes versus whites is this basically embedded belief that the media has seeded that whites are somehow unfairly and atrociously targeting minorities, and the minorities feel that they're in peril and they're victims and they need to react and they need to fight back, and that is sort of the undertone of all of this messaging, right? The amount of just obsessive focus that they show to Black Lives Matter protesters, Antifa being punching other people, and basically the repeated excuses that they throw out there that, oh no, these guys were just defending themselves, when it's blatantly obvious that they didn't. When Jesse Smollett showed up with the most ludicrous story, for God's sake, he kept a noose around his neck for 2 hours before reporting the crime. I mean, that alone should have been a red flag of, okay, what the hell is going on? This guy's making some shit up. No one even dared say anything but it's a lynching, it's a hateful crime, Trump, right? At the same time, Hayden, the conservative kid in Berkeley, gets punched in the face on video. It is as clear as day. The guy brutally gets attacked. And the reporting, if it's reported at all, it's allegedly attacked. Alleged what? Alleged, it was clear as day. If there was any alleged attack, it was on Jesse, because there was at least no recording of him being attacked. And of course, then it comes out that Jesse completely made the shit up. And they still want to herald him as some kind of hero. Well, he was misguided, he was this, he was that. And no one has yet come down with any one of the sort of convenient allies that he had. So Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, because they wanted to push the lynching bill. Something tells me that they actually were full. I think Jesse, who has campaigned with both of them, I think he was fully in cahoots with them. But whatever. What was Cory Booker and Kamala Harris's response when asked to comment after it came out that he was bullshitting? Oh, well, we're still waiting for the facts to come in, and then we'll make a statement. Where'd that statement come? No, I don't think it'll ever come. Now, this is manipulation of the evidence, right? And it actively libels an entire race group, namely the white people, but more importantly, the minority groups. They're putting lives at risk because they're creating an element of sort of resentful hate, right? Something that wants to make you act. And basically, if you're in a minority group, if you're in any way marginalized, you're going to be looking for ways in which you are imaginarily marginalized, because you're being completely force-fed this narrative of you're being marginalized, you're being oppressed. No matter if you don't feel it, you're being oppressed. So your likelihood of reacting positively in any sort of borderline situation is very low. You're likely to overreact, sometimes engage in violence, and most likely, because let's be honest, if there's a clash with police, or if there's a clash with with basically a trained officer, you're likely to lose, and possibly lose your life. So when are they going to take accountability for this incremental risk? I mean, they're fomenting basically unrest in the country overall. So we're all at each other's throats. It's creating all sorts of flare-ups for no apparent reason, because they know that it's baseless. They're only serving their profit motive. Well, isn't it time to hold them accountable? I mean, how about a class action suit to basically make them use some of those millions they created to repair the damage they did to minority groups by creating this atmosphere of hate? I mean, to me, that seems like that would be a perfect punctuation to this entire thing. Anyways, in closing, I'd really like to drive home this statement. I don't believe that racism is a continuing issue in America. I believe ever since the Civil War that was fought on the basis of slavery, you have to remember that for every 6 black people that were freed, 1 northern kid gave his life, right? 1 life for every 6 souls freed. Right there, it shows you that America did pay a price for its heinous past. Not to dwell on it, but also a heinous past that was primarily perpetrated by what we now know to be Democrats. For all of the bullshit obfuscation that they've done, no Republican owned a slave in the Civil War. No Republican. Look it up, right? Most of the racist, KKK, Jim Crow, all of this, all of the things that have suppressed the black population historically have always come at the hands of the Democratic Party. And now they somehow managed to manipulate the storyline and have declared themselves the civil rights champions of the world. And somehow they're the ones that have they've been looking out for minorities everywhere. Then why is it that minorities are worse off today than they were even back in Jim Crow days? That there's less family cohesion now than even in slavery times. Where has this improvement gone? Because it isn't there. Because fundamentally, Republicans work on a set of conservative principles, the founding father principles. So yes, there was a problem in applying these uniformly at the formation of the country. They took the easier route to incorporate the country, get everybody in a federation first, and then deal with slavery down the line. Maybe it wasn't the most noble approach, but it was the most practical approach. But they took care of it, right? And they put their money where their mouth is. They sacrificed lives until this was done, right? So in general, America is the most successful multinational experiment in any corner of the world. No other place do multiple nations get along better than here. Not in Europe, not in any place in Asia, not in any place in any other place except America. So to keep this bullshit narrative around this active sort of hatred that Americans somehow have for others is complete and utter bullshit, and it's being fed to you to manipulate you in a specific way. And it's for the most base reasons. It is for cash. It is for profit. It shows the complete disdain that the left has for minorities, for improving the lots of others. It's just it thinks nothing of using basically people in distress and just feed more fuel to the fire, feed more pain to them, and then basically get them to feel resentful and get them to feel rebellious, and therefore control their vote. I think it's time that we do our own thinking. I think it's time that we react based on facts and not on rhetoric. And frankly, it's time to just basically start boycotting the media, start vocalizing that they need to be accountable, and start basically having them revert to journalism ethics or just shut down. And that's my story.